History books often credit kings and warriors with shaping our world. But what if the real game changers were forces no army could defeat? Think earthquakes that toppled empires, storms that sank fleets, or plagues that rewrote the fate of nations. Time and again, nature has stepped in like a silent puppeteer, yanking the strings of human destiny when we least expected it. From a single volcanic eruption that plunged the world into famine to a hurricane that decided the fate of revolutions, these aren't just footnotes, they're turning points that reshaped civilizations. Today, we're uncovering 50 moments where the Earth itself became the ultimate historical architect, proving that even the mightiest human plans are no match for the fury or mercy of the natural world. In the year 536, a mysterious darkness descended across the world, not from war or a celestial event, but from a force far beyond human control. A colossal volcanic eruption, likely in Iceland, hurled millions of tons of ash into the atmosphere, blotting out the sun for months. Temperatures plummeted, snow fell in summer, and crops withered in the endless twilight. Famine spread like wildfire, weakening entire populations, but nature wasn't done yet. In the wake of starvation came an even deadlier blow, the plague of Justinian. With immune systems crippled by hunger, millions fell to this horrific disease, accelerating the collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire. This wasn't just a bad year, it was a catastrophe that reshaped continents. The Byzantine Empire never fully recovered, entire regions were depopulated, and the balance of power in Europe and the Middle East shifted forever. All because of an eruption no human eye even witnessed, proof that sometimes the smallest pebble tossed by nature can trigger an avalanche of history. While the volcanic winter of 536 reshaped empires, another biological catastrophe would strike with even deadlier precision 8 centuries later. Ships docking in Sicily in 1347 carried more than trade goods, they bore an invisible stowaway that would rewrite human history. The Black Death, carried by fleas on rats, swept through 14th century Europe like a wildfire, killing an estimated 1 in 3 people. Entire villages vanished overnight, the streets of once bustling cities filled with corpses faster than they could be buried. But this wasn't just a tragedy, it became the great equalizer, shaking society to its core. With so many dead, labor became priceless. Peasants who survived suddenly had bargaining power for the first time, demanding wages and freedoms their ancestors never dreamed of. The old feudal system, where lords ruled and peasants toiled, crumbled under the weight of empty fields and abandoned manors. Even the church lost its grip as people questioned why prayers couldn't stop the dying. The plague didn't just take lives, it upended hierarchies, redistributed wealth, and planted the seeds of the Renaissance. When the last grave was filled, Europe would never be the same again. For 300 years, Europe shivered under nature's icy grip, a slow, creeping catastrophe we now call the Little Ice Age. Glaciers advanced like unstoppable armies, swallowing farms and villages whole. Rivers that once bustled with trade froze solid for months, cutting off vital supply routes, but the real devastation unfolded in the fields. Crops failed year after year as growing seasons shrank and unseasonal frost blackened tender shoots. Famine became a constant specter, gnawing at entire populations. In 1693 alone, France lost over 1 million people to starvation as wheat withered in the unrelenting cold. Desperate peasants scoured forests for acorns and bark just to survive, and hunger, as history shows, is the kindling for revolution. By 1789, bread prices had skyrocketed, turning every bakery into a powder keg. When Parisian mobs stormed the Bastille, they weren't just chanting for liberty, they were howling for food. The French Revolution's fire wasn't just lit by philosophers, it was fueled by empty stomachs and frozen harvests. The Little Ice Age didn't just change the weather, it bent the arc of history, proving that even a few degrees of cooling can topple kings. the ground beneath Lisbon trembled without warning on the morning of November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day, when churches across the city were packed with worshippers. In less than 6 minutes, one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded in Europe reduced a thriving capital to rubble. Buildings collapsed like sandcastles, crushing thousands. Then came the fires, ignited by overturned candles and kitchen hearths, raging unchecked through the wreckage. As if that weren't enough, survivors fleeing toward the waterfront witnessed something even more terrifying: the sea retreating, only to roar back as a monstrous tsunami. Waves as high as 20 feet swallowed the harbor, drowning those who'd thought they'd escaped. By the time the disaster was over, Lisbon had lost up to a third of its population, some 60,000 souls. But the quake's shockwaves rippled far beyond Portugal's borders. Enlightenment thinkers across Europe grappled with a burning question: how could a loving God allow such indiscriminate suffering? Voltaire poured his outrage into a scathing poem, mocking the idea of divine benevolence in the face of random tragedy. His contemporary, Rousseau, argued instead that human choices, like building a crowded city on unstable ground, had magnified nature's wrath. Their debate ignited new ways of thinking about morality, natural law, and humanity's place in the universe. Meanwhile, Lisbon itself became a laboratory for disaster response. The Marquis of Pombal, Portugal's pragmatic prime minister, didn't waste time on prayers he organized. His teams mapped the wreckage, created early triage systems for the injured, and even designed seismically resistant buildings with flexible wooden frameworks. For the first time in history, a government treated disaster recovery not as an act of fate, but as a scientific challenge to be solved. The Lisbon earthquake didn't just level a city. It shook the foundations of European thought and planted the seeds of modern emergency management, proving that even in ruin, nature could force humanity to evolve. 1816 should have been just another year in history, but instead it became known as the year summer never came. Across Europe and North America, morning frosts lingered into July, killing seedlings in their tracks. Snow fell in New England during June, while icy rains pelted European harvests into mush. The culprit, a volcanic explosion so massive it makes modern eruptions look like firecrackers. The previous year, Mount Tambora in Indonesia had detonated with the force of 60,000 Hiroshima bombs, launching 24 cubic miles of ash into the stratosphere. That debris became a global shroud, filtering out sunlight and plunging temperatures worldwide. The human cost was staggering. Famine stalked Switzerland, where desperate families boiled sawdust into bitter bread. In Ireland, failing potato crops pushed thousands toward starvation decades before the Great Famine. Even Thomas Jefferson, retired at Monticello, watched his fields fail and spiraled into debt. But amid the suffering, creativity flickered like a candle in the cold. Trapped indoors by relentless storms near Lake Geneva, a young Mary Shelley and her literary friends competed to write the most chilling tale. Her answer, Frankenstein, was born from the gloom, a story of unnatural creation that echoed the unnatural climate outside. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, farmers fleeing New England's ruined harvests loaded wagons with everything they owned. Their destination, the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, where word promised fertile soil untouched by volcanic winter. This westward surge, driven by desperation, reshaped America's demographic map years before gold or railroads would. Tambora's eruption lasted only days, but its aftermath proved nature doesn't need armies to redirect history. Sometimes all it takes is a darkened sky. And a world left shivering in its shadow. While volcanoes and plagues reshaped continents, America faced its own environmental reckoning in the early 20th century, not with fire or disease, but with wind and water. On the Great Plains, decades of deep plowing had stripped away the prairie grasses that once held the soil in place. Then, in the 1930s, the rain stopped. Month after month, the sun baked the earth into powder, and when the winds came, they carried it all away. dust storms towered like moving mountains, blackening skies from Texas to Canada. Farmers watched helplessly as their topsoil, sometimes entire fields, vanished into the air. Children wore dust masks to school, while housewives stuffed wet rags under doors, only to find inches of grime coating every surface by morning. This was the Dust Bowl, an ecological disaster born from human ambition colliding with nature's limits. But the plains weren't the only battleground. Just years earlier, in 1927, the Mississippi River burst its banks in what remains the worst flood in U.S. history. Levees built to control the river instead funneled the deluge into a catastrophic surge, submerging 27,000 square miles. Over 500,000 people lost homes, with black sharecroppers bearing the brunt of the suffering. Stranded on rooftops or herded into relief camps with armed guards, their plight exposed the racial inequalities woven into America's relationship with the land. These twin disasters did more than destroy property, they shattered illusions. The Dust Bowl proved that even a nation riding high on industrial progress couldn't outrun ecological consequences. The flood revealed how infrastructure built without foresight could turn natural cycles into weapons. Together, they forced a reckoning, pushing President Franklin Roosevelt to pioneer the New Deal's conservation programs, from planting shelter belts to prevent erosion to creating agencies like the Tennessee Valley Authority. And as the land failed, people moved not by choice but necessity. Over 2 million Dust Bowl refugees trekked west, while black Southerners, already reeling from the flood's devastation, joined the Great Migration in even greater numbers, seeking jobs and dignity in northern cities. Nature hadn't just altered the landscape, it had redrawn the map of American society. On August 27, 1883, a sound echoed across the Indian Ocean, so loud it ruptured eardrums 40 miles away, the final death cry of Krakatoa. This wasn't just another volcanic eruption. It was an explosion 4,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The entire island volcano vaporized in an instant, sending shockwaves that circled the globe 7 times and tsunami waves that drowned 36,000 people on nearby coasts. But Krakatoa's true reach extended far beyond its fiery blast zone. The volcano spewed enough ash into the upper atmosphere to filter sunlight worldwide, painting sunsets so vibrantly red they looked like the sky was bleeding. For months, painters from London to New York scrambled to capture the unnatural hues on canvas. Turner's fiery skies suddenly looked tame by comparison. Meanwhile, global temperatures dropped by over 2 degrees Fahrenheit as ash veiled the sun, disrupting monsoons and triggering bizarre weather. Egypt's Nile flood failed, crops withered across Asia, and Europe shivered through years of volcanic winter. Even the oceans felt the change. Tides became erratic, with harbors experiencing sudden, unexplained surges. Yet amid the chaos, Krakatoa left an unexpected legacy. Scientists analyzing the eruption's atmospheric effects made groundbreaking discoveries about jet streams and how particles travel across continents. Farmers as far as California noted how the vivid sunsets preceded frosts, learning to read the sky as an early warning system, and those haunting sunsets. They didn't just inspire art, they sparked new scientific curiosity about Earth's interconnected systems, proving that even catastrophe could be a classroom. Krakatoa didn't just destroy, it revealed how tightly our world is stitched together, where one crack in the Pacific could ripple into every corner of human life. Spring of 1918 should have brought hope. The Great War was nearing its end and victory seemed close, but as troops crisscrossed continents, an invisible killer hitched a ride. The Spanish flu didn't start in Spain, but wartime censorship kept other nations from reporting outbreaks. Only Spain, neutral in the conflict, admitted the truth, giving the pandemic its misleading name. Within months, this virus would claim more lives than the entire First World War, proving nature could outpace even humanity's deadliest weapons. The flu struck with terrifying speed. One moment, a soldier might feel fine. Within hours, their skin turned blue as lungs filled with fluid. Morgues overflowed, forcing families to bury their own in makeshift graves. The young and healthy suffered worst, immune systems overreacting in what doctors called a cytokine storm, turning the body's defenses against itself. Makeshift hospitals sprang up in gymnasiums and churches, yet nothing could stop the tide. Philadelphia held a massive Liberty Loan parade to boost morale. Days later, 12,000 corpses piled up as the virus ripped through the crowd. But amid the horror came unexpected change. Governments realized traditional responses, denial or downplaying the threat, only worsened the crisis. Cities that acted fast, like St. Louis, with its early school closures and bans on public gatherings, saw death rates half those of places like Philadelphia. The pandemic forced nations to confront a harsh truth: diseases don't respect borders. By 1920, the League of Nations had established its health organization, laying groundwork for today's global health networks. Meanwhile, scientists racing to understand the virus made leaps in epidemiology, from tracking infection patterns to grasping how viruses mutate. The Spanish flu didn't just steal lives, it shattered old assumptions. The world learned that modern transportation could spread pathogens faster than any medieval plague ship, that transparency saved lives more effectively than secrecy, and that health was no longer just personal, it was collective. As soldiers returned home, they carried more than wartime scars. They bore witness to nature's power to rewrite history in a single, gasping breath. At 5:12 in the morning on April 18, 1906, San Francisco shuddered awake to a nightmare. The ground convulsed for less than a minute, but that was all it took to snap gas lines, crumble brick buildings, and topple chimneys onto wooden rooftops. Then came the fires, raging unchecked as broken water mains left firefighters helpless. For 3 days, flames devoured entire neighborhoods, their glow visible from ships 80 miles out to sea. By the time the last embers cooled, over 80% of the city lay in ruins, and thousands were dead or homeless. Yet from the ashes rose something unexpected, a revolution in how humanity confronts seismic threats. Geologist Henry Fielding Reid studied the twisted fences and cracked roads, piecing together a radical new idea: elastic rebound theory. He realized earthquakes weren't random acts of chaos, but the result of tectonic plates building up stress until they violently snapped back, like a bent branch finally breaking. This wasn't just academic curiosity, it became the foundation of modern seismology. Meanwhile, San Francisco itself became a living laboratory. Architects tossed out old blueprints, designing buildings with flexible steel frames to sway with tremors instead of resisting them. New fire codes mandated quake-resistant water mains and banned flammable materials in construction. Even the city's layout transformed, with wider streets to prevent fire jumps and emergency corridors carved through dense urban blocks. The disaster also exposed deeper fractures, like how relief efforts prioritized wealthy neighborhoods while Chinatown's residents faced forced relocations under the guise of safety. But the quake's legacy endures in every earthquake drill, every reinforced skyscraper, and every seismic sensor humming beneath our feet. San Francisco didn't just rebuild, it rewrote the rules, proving that sometimes progress requires the earth itself to shake us awake. On November 12, 1970, the deadliest tropical cyclone ever recorded gathered strength over the Bay of Bengal. The Bhola cyclone struck East Pakistan, modern-day Bangladesh, with a storm surge towering over 20 feet, swallowing entire villages in its path. Winds howled at 115 miles per hour, but the water proved far deadlier, drowning an estimated 500,000 people overnight. Bodies clogged rivers for weeks. Survivors drank from ponds fouled by corpses. Yet amidst the devastation, this catastrophe became the spark for something unexpected: a nation's birth. The Pakistani government's sluggish response to the disaster laid bare the stark neglect of East Pakistan by its Western rulers. While international aid poured in, local leaders accused Islamabad of hoarding supplies. Protests erupted, fueling the flames of a growing independence movement. Within months, Bangladesh's War of Liberation began, and by 1971, the world had a new country forged not just by political will, but by the fury of a storm that exposed injustices too deep to ignore. 2 decades later, history seemed to repeat itself. In April 1991, another monstrous cyclone barreled toward Bangladesh, this time with winds hitting 155 miles per hour. The death toll climbed to nearly 140,000, but something crucial had changed. Lessons from Bola's tragedy led to the creation of early warning systems and cyclone shelters dotting the coastline. Where evacuation efforts succeeded, survival rates soared. These twin disasters reveal nature's cruel duality, destroyer and teacher. One storm helped birth a nation, the other forced humanity to confront its own vulnerability. Today, Bangladesh stands as a global leader in disaster resilience, proving that even the deadliest winds can't extinguish the will to adapt. When the next cyclone comes, and it will, the lessons written in blood and water won't be forgotten. On December 26, 2004, the ocean pulled back from shorelines across the Indian Ocean in a silent, ominous warning. Tourists in Thailand waded into the suddenly shallow waters, marveling at stranded fish, completely unaware they were witnessing nature drawing its breath before the strike. Then came the tsunami, a wall of water traveling at jetliner speeds, swallowing entire coastlines from Indonesia to Africa in minutes. The force uprooted trees like matchsticks, flipped cars like toys, and reduced concrete buildings to piles of rubble. When the waters finally receded, they left behind a staggering toll. 230,000 lives lost across 14 countries, entire villages erased from the map, and millions left homeless in an instant. But in the wake of incomprehensible loss, humanity's better angels took flight. The disaster triggered the largest humanitarian response in history, with over $14 billion in aid flooding in from every corner of the globe. Ordinary citizens donated everything from medical supplies to vacation days, while militaries and NGOs orchestrated massive airlifts of food and clean water. For the first time, the world saw social media's potential for crisis response, as survivors used fledgling platforms to locate missing loved ones and coordinate relief. Perhaps the most enduring legacy emerged from the science of prevention. Before 2004, the Indian Ocean had no tsunami warning system, while the Pacific's network, developed after a 1960 Chile quake, stood silent. That changed overnight. Within a year, buoy-based sensors dotted the ocean floor, linked to alarm towers along vulnerable coasts. When another massive quake struck in 2012, sirens blared across Indonesia with hours to spare, and this time deaths numbered in the dozens, not hundreds of thousands. The Indian Ocean tsunami didn't just expose our vulnerability, it forged a global commitment to outsmart the inevitable next wave. What began as a day of unimaginable horror became a turning point, proof that even in the face of nature's raw power, human ingenuity and solidarity can rise to meet it. The skies over Europe turned eerily quiet in April 2010, not from war or economic collapse, but from a volcano with a name few could pronounce. Eyjafjallajökull, Iceland's fiery giant, awoke after nearly 2 centuries of silence, spewing an ash plume 9 miles high. But this wasn't just lava and smoke, it was microscopic glass and rock particles, fine as flour and deadly to aircraft engines. As winds carried the cloud southward, aviation authorities faced an impossible choice: risk jets ingesting ash that could melt into engine-clogging cement or shut down air travel entirely. They chose caution, grounding over 100,000 flights across Europe in the largest airspace closure since World War II. For travelers, it was chaos. Stranded passengers slept on airport floors, business deals evaporated, and perishable goods rotted on tarmacs. The economic toll soared past $5 billion, but the real revelation was how fragile our interconnected world had become. A single eruption in a remote corner of the Arctic could paralyze global supply chains, from Kenyan flower farmers losing shipments to German factories idling without critical parts. Suddenly, everyone from CEOs to tourists grasped the domino effect of nature's whims. Yet amid the disruption, innovation thrived. Airlines overhauled ash detection systems, deploying infrared sensors and satellite tracking to map hazardous zones in real time. Scientists refined ash dispersal models, turning guesswork into precise forecasts. And for the first time, video calls and remote work surged as alternatives to business travel. A quiet preview of the digital shift that would define the next decade. Eyjafjallajökull's eruption lasted just weeks, but its legacy lingers in every flight plan that now accounts for nature's unpredictability. Sometimes progress doesn't come from smooth skies, it's born in the turbulence when the ground itself reminds us who's really in control. When Hurricane Katrina roared ashore on August 29, 2005, it wasn't just wind and water that battered New Orleans, it was the brutal unveiling of America's deepest fractures. Forecasters had warned for days, yet when the levees broke, 80% of the city flooded in hours, turning streets into rivers and attics into last-chance refuges. But the disaster didn't strike equally. Wealthier districts perched on higher ground stayed relatively dry, while lower-income neighborhoods historically home to black communities became toxic lakes laced with sewage and chemicals. The world watched in horror as thousands, overwhelmingly people of color, languished for days without food or water at the Superdome and Convention Center. Helicopters circled overhead, yet federal and state agencies seemed paralyzed by bureaucracy. Hekuva Job Brownie, the now infamous praise from President Bush to his embattled FEMA director, became shorthand for a response as broken as the levees themselves. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens rallied. Fishermen from Louisiana's bayous used their boats to rescue strangers, while doctors turned abandoned hospitals into makeshift clinics. Katrina's legacy is a scar and a lesson. It exposed how infrastructure neglect and systemic inequality could turn a natural disaster into a man-made catastrophe. In the years since, New Orleans rebuilt stronger levees but also birthed a generation of activists demanding justice in climate resilience. When the next storm comes, the question won't just be about wind speeds, it'll be about who we've learned to protect. At 2:46 p.m. on March 11, 2011, the seafloor off Japan's eastern coast ruptured with such violence that it shifted the Earth's axis by 10 inches. The Tohoku earthquake, a magnitude 9 monster, unleashed a tsunami with waves cresting over 130 feet, taller than a 10-story building. Entire towns vanished under the black surge as cars and houses became projectiles in the churning water. But the horror didn't end there. At the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, the tsunami overwhelmed seawalls and backup generators, triggering meltdowns in 3 reactors. Explosions tore through containment buildings, spewing radiation into the air while workers battled to prevent an even greater catastrophe in scenes reminiscent of a dystopian thriller. Over 160,000 people fled their homes in the largest nuclear evacuation since Chernobyl, some never to return. Japan's relationship with nuclear energy shattered along with Fukushima's reactors. Before the disaster, the country had leaned heavily on atomic power, with plans to supply half its electricity from reactors by 2030, but public trust evaporated overnight. Within a year, every one of Japan's 54 reactors sat idle as mass protests demanded safer alternatives. The government pivoted hard, pouring billions into renewable energy. Solar panels bloomed on rooftops, wind farms dotted coastlines, and energy conservation became a national mantra. Yet the shift wasn't without consequences. Importing fossil fuels to fill the gap sent electricity prices soaring and carbon emissions climbing, forcing tough choices between sustainability and economics. Meanwhile, ghost towns near Fukushima stood as haunting reminders of nuclear power's double-edged promise: clean energy until disaster strikes. The Tohoku tragedy did more than reshape Japan's energy policy. It forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. Even the most advanced engineering can buckle under nature's wrath, and every solution comes with its own risks. Today, as debates over nuclear power's role in fighting climate change rage on, Fukushima remains a stark lesson in humility, a reminder that progress must walk hand in hand with respect for the forces we can predict but never fully control. Fields across Ireland turned black in the summer of 1845, not from fire but from a silent killer. A mysterious blight had crossed the Atlantic, carried unseen on ships from North America. Within weeks, potato plants that should have yielded hearty harvests collapsed into stinking, inedible sludge. For millions of Irish families, this wasn't just a failed crop, it was a death sentence. Potatoes weren't merely a staple, they were the foundation of survival, the only crop that could feed a family on tiny plots of land. As the blight returned year after year, desperation took root. Starving children scraped seaweed from rocks or chewed grass to quiet their stomachs. Cholera and typhus stalked overcrowded workhouses where entire families perished together. Over 1 million Irish died not from war or plague, but from a microscopic fungus that reshaped a nation. Across the Irish Sea, the Highlands of Scotland faced a nearly identical tragedy. The same blight ravaged their potato crops, but here, the disaster struck a culture already buckling under oppression. Decades earlier, English landlords had forced Highland clans off ancestral lands in the notorious clearances, replacing entire villages with sheep pastures. Those who remained clung to marginal plots, surviving almost entirely on potatoes. When the blight hit, there was no safety net, just eviction notices for starving tenants who couldn't pay rent. As waves of Scots fled to Canada and Australia, something irreplaceable vanished with them. The Gaelic language, traditional music, and centuries-old clan ties frayed under the weight of exile and hunger. Yet these twin famines did more than empty landscapes, they redrew the world's demographic map. Over 2 million Irish boarded coffin ships to America, many so weakened by starvation they died before reaching New York or Boston. Those who survived became the labor force that built railroads, fought in Civil War regiments, and reshaped American politics. In Scotland, the exodus scattered Highlanders from Nova Scotia to New Zealand, their bagpipe tunes and tartan traditions echoing in foreign lands as the old ways faded at home. The blight itself lasted barely a decade, but its consequences endure. Ireland's population still hasn't recovered to pre-famine levels. Highland villages stand as crumbling ruins, their stories kept alive only in museums. These weren't just crop failures, they were cultural earthquakes, proving that sometimes the smallest organism can unravel the fabric of nations, scattering people and traditions like seeds on the wind. In the summer of 1931, China's rivers swelled beyond recognition after months of relentless rain. The Yangtze, Yellow, and Huai rivers burst their banks with apocalyptic force, unleashing floods that drowned an area larger than England. Entire villages vanished underwater overnight, their residents swept away by currents strong enough to topple pagodas. By the time the waters receded, an estimated 4 million people had perished, more than some battles of World War II. But the devastation didn't stop there. Crops rotted in the fields, livestock drowned by the millions, and survivors faced outbreaks of cholera and typhus in makeshift refugee camps. This wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a political earthquake. China, already fractured by civil war between nationalists and communists, now teetered on collapse. The floods exposed the government's inability to protect its people, eroding what little trust remained. Desperate peasants, their lands destroyed, joined rebel armies in droves. Bandit warlords carved out fiefdoms in the chaos, while Japanese forces already occupying Manchuria saw weakness to exploit. Within 6 years, they would launch a full-scale invasion, using the region's instability as justification. Yet amid the suffering, the floods birthed something unexpected: modern disaster science. Hydrologists mapping the catastrophe discovered how deforestation and poor land management had amplified the destruction lessons that later shaped global flood prevention strategies. The 1931 deluge didn't just rewrite China's fate. It revealed how environmental neglect can turn heavy rain into a weapon of mass upheaval, proving that sometimes history's turning points arrive not with a bang but with a rising tide. On a quiet August night in 1986, the villages surrounding Lake Nyos in Cameroon went to sleep under a blanket of stars, but by dawn, over 1,700 people and countless animals lay dead, their bodies eerily untouched by violence. The killer left no footprints, no bullet casings, just silence. This wasn't a massacre carried out by human hands, it was nature's cruelest chemistry experiment. Deep beneath Lake Nyos, a sleeping giant had stirred. Dissolved carbon dioxide, accumulated over centuries from volcanic vents, suddenly erupted from the depths like a shaken soda bottle uncapped. A dense, invisible cloud of CO2 rolled downhill at nearly 60 miles per hour, suffocating everything in its path. Survivors waking to the horror found loved ones still in bed, their faces frozen in peaceful expressions, as if death had come without warning or pain. Entire families perished together, livestock collapsed mid-step, and birds fell from trees mid-flight. The gas, heavier than air, clung to the ground, turning valleys into death traps long after the initial surge. Scientists arriving at the scene faced a macabre puzzle. Why had the lake, so placid on the surface, turned lethal? Their investigation revealed a rare phenomenon called a limnic eruption, where CO2 trapped in deep water escapes catastrophically. Before Nyos, no one knew such disasters were possible, but this tragedy sparked urgent innovation. Engineers devised degassing pipes for similar lakes, essentially giant soda straws, to slowly release trapped CO2 before it reaches deadly concentrations. Today, lakes like Nyos and neighboring Monowan are monitored constantly, their waters gently bubbling as they exhale their invisible threat. The Nyos disaster didn't just rewrite geology textbooks, it exposed how little we still understand about Earth's hidden dangers. Sometimes progress comes dressed in tragedy's clothes, forcing us to confront threats we never knew existed until they steal our breath away. The ground beneath the American frontier convulsed violently on December 16, 1811, not in California or Alaska, but in what's now Missouri, far from any known fault line. The first quake struck before dawn, its magnitude later estimated at a staggering 7.7, strong enough to topple buildings if there had been any substantial structures around. But the real spectacle unfolded along the Mississippi River, where the force of the trembler literally reversed the river's flow for hours. Sandbars erupted like geysers, landslides swallowed entire forests, and fissures split the earth so wide locals reported seeing bursts of sulfurous smoke. 3 more massive quakes followed over the next 2 months, each reshaping the landscape with terrifying creativity. The shaking rang church bells as far away as Boston and startled President James Madison awake in the White House. Yet the most enduring impact wasn't in the destruction, it was in the sudden shift of human ambition. Settlers who'd viewed the Mississippi Valley as prime farmland now saw it as a land of biblical instability. Whole communities relocated eastward, while riverfront towns like New Madrid, once thriving trade hubs, dwindled into ghost towns. Ironically, this seismic exodus opened the Ohio River Valley to faster development, rerouting America's westward expansion like an unseen hand adjusting a compass. The New Madrid quakes didn't just crack the earth, they cracked open new chapters of migration and commerce, proving that even in a young nation's story, nature could still rewrite the script with a single, violent tremor. The residents of Galveston, Texas barely noticed the clouds gathering on September 8, 1900. By afternoon, those same winds would be tearing roofs off buildings like tissue paper, and the Gulf's waves would rise higher than the city itself. When the Great Galveston Hurricane made landfall, it didn't just bring rain, it unleashed a 15-foot storm surge that transformed streets into raging rivers, sweeping entire neighborhoods out to sea. By nightfall, over 8,000 people had drowned in what remains America's deadliest natural disaster. But the storm's aftermath revealed something even more startling than its fury: human complacency. Scientists had warned for years that the island, barely 5 feet above sea level, sat defenseless against major hurricanes. Yet civic leaders, banking on Galveston's booming port economy, dismissed concerns as alarmist. The city's flat geography, once its greatest asset for easy construction, became its death sentence when the water came rushing in. Survivors wading through the wreckage found corpses tangled in debris for weeks, some buried in mass graves because coffins couldn't be built fast enough. Galveston's near-total destruction forced a radical rethink of coastal survival. Engineers rolled up their sleeves and essentially reinvented the city from the ground up. First came an immense seawall 17 feet high and over 10 miles long, designed to blunt future storm surges. Then, in a move worthy of science fiction, they raised the entire city's elevation by pumping sand from the seabed. Houses were hoisted on jackscrews while new foundations were built beneath them, creating an artificial plateau. The hurricane's legacy echoes in every coastal city today. Galveston proved that ignoring nature's warnings comes at a catastrophic cost, but also that human ingenuity, when paired with humility, can rebuild stronger. Though the scars remained, the city's resurrection set the standard for disaster resilience, a lesson written in seawater and sacrifice. When the next storm comes, it won't just be Galveston remembering, it'll be every shoreline community that learned from its tragedy. At 3:42 in the morning on July 28, 1976, the sleeping city of Tangshan simply ceased to exist. One moment, nearly 1 million people rested in their beds. The next, 85% of the buildings collapsed in a single, convulsive minute. Brick apartment blocks pancaked into rubble, trapping families beneath tons of debris. Hospital wards crumbled with patients still inside, while underground mines flooded with terrified workers. The magnitude 7.8 quake struck without warning, its epicenter directly beneath the industrial heart of China. But the silence that followed was almost as deadly as the quake itself. In an era when China's government tightly controlled information, news of the disaster barely trickled out. Initial reports claimed only minor damage, even as survivors dug through ruins with bare hands, searching for loved ones without heavy equipment or medical aid. Foreign aid offers were rejected for weeks, while the true death toll remained a state secret. The official count eventually admitted to 242,000 deaths, but independent estimates suggest the real number could be double that, making Tangshan the deadliest earthquake of the 20th century. The tragedy exposed a chilling reality. Secrecy can be as destructive as seismic forces. Without accurate information, relief efforts stalled and preventable deaths mounted. Yet Tangshan also became a lesson in resilience. Within a decade, a new city rose from the ruins, this time with earthquake-resistant designs and emergency protocols. The disaster forced China to confront the cost of opacity, slowly shifting toward greater transparency in future crises. Tangshan's legacy isn't just written in rebuilt streets, it's in every disaster response plan that prioritizes truth over control. Sometimes the ground doesn't just shake cities, it shakes the foundations of power, revealing what happens when nature's violence meets human silence. For decades, the El Niño phenomenon has been nature's way of reminding us who's really in charge of global climate patterns, and few events proved this more dramatically than the back-to-back monsters of 1997 and 2015. The first struck with such intensity it rewrote the record books, pushing global temperatures to heights unseen for a century. Across Southeast Asia, rainforests that usually dripped with moisture became tinderboxes, fueling wildfires so vast their smoke blanketed multiple countries, turning day into night. Meanwhile, drought withered crops from Australia's wheat belt to Indonesia's rice paddies, sending food prices spiraling worldwide. But the real shock came when scientists realized this wasn't just another El Niño, it was the most powerful one ever measured, a preview of what climate chaos might look like in an overheating world. 18 years later, the planet got a grim encore. The 2015 El Niño didn't just rival its predecessor, it shattered its records, making the 90s event look almost mild by comparison. This time, the impacts were even more lopsided. California's reservoirs sank to historic lows as drought baked the state, while across the Pacific, torrential rains drowned Peruvian villages and triggered deadly landslides. But the most alarming twist was how these twin climate events exposed our growing vulnerability. Between them, they contributed to spikes in global food prices that pushed millions into hunger, proving how tightly our modern world is tethered to ancient weather cycles. Yet these disasters also left behind unexpected gifts. After '97, meteorologists overhauled forecasting models, giving farmers from Kenya to Kansas earlier warnings to adapt planting cycles. By 2015, satellites could track El Niño's ripple effects in real time, from coral bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef to shifting monsoon patterns over India. What began as natural phenomena became global wake-up calls, proof that even as climate change amplifies nature's punches, knowledge might just be our best defense. The next El Niño will come fiercer than ever, but this time we won't be caught sleeping. For 57 days, Mount St. Helens trembled with ominous earthquakes, a warning the mountain wasn't sleeping but stirring. Then, on May 18, 1980, at 8:32 in the morning, the entire north face of the volcano collapsed in the largest landslide ever recorded. That sudden release of pressure triggered a cataclysmic lateral blast, shooting superheated gas and rock sideways at nearly 300 miles per hour, fast enough to flatten entire forests in seconds. Trees within 6 miles were stripped bare like matchsticks, while ash plumes soared 15 miles high, turning day into night across 3 states. The devastation was unprecedented: 57 lives lost, 200 homes destroyed, and over 200 square miles of wilderness reduced to a gray wasteland. But amid the destruction, scientists found something extraordinary: a living laboratory. Volcanologists had front-row seats to an eruption captured on film and sensors for the first time, revolutionizing their understanding of pyroclastic flows and volcanic landslides. Before St. Helens, no one realized how deadly lateral explosions could be now. Threat assessments for millions living near volcanoes incorporate this deadly angle. Even more surprising was nature's rebound. Within weeks, lupine flowers sprouted from the ash, their roots fixing nitrogen to revive the barren soil. Ecologists watched in awe as spiders ballooned in on silk threads, followed by pocket gophers that survived underground, their burrows mixing fertile soil with volcanic debris. Scientists had assumed recovery would take centuries, yet within decades, elk herds browsed new meadows where lifeless ash once lay. Mount St. Helens didn't just blow its top, it blew open textbooks, rewriting our ideas about destruction and renewal. Today, its scarred slopes stand as proof. Even after nature's fury, life doesn't surrender, it adapts. In the summer of 2003, Europe baked under skies that refused to relent. Temperatures soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, levels unseen for centuries, turning city streets into furnaces and apartments into ovens. The elderly suffered most, their bodies struggling to cope as nightfall brought no relief from the suffocating heat. By the time cooler winds finally arrived, over 70,000 lives had been lost, their names etched into the record books as victims of the deadliest climate event in modern European history. What made this catastrophe so shocking wasn't just the heat. It was the realization of how unprepared modern societies were. Paris became an emblem of the crisis, where morgues overflowed as hospitals scrambled to treat heatstroke victims. Authorities hadn't anticipated the need for cooling centers or public health warnings. In Italy, retirement homes lacked even basic air conditioning, leaving staff to fan residents with damp towels as temperatures climbed. The disaster peeled back the veneer of progress, exposing how infrastructure designed for predictable seasons could buckle when nature rewrote the rules. Yet from the tragedy came urgent change. Heatwave early warning systems now blanket the continent, alerting cities when deadly temperatures loom. Urban planners plant cool corridors of trees to shield sidewalks, while architects redesign buildings with reflective materials and ventilation. Perhaps most crucially, governments recognize that protecting the vulnerable isn't just about weather forecasts, it's about checking on isolated seniors, transforming libraries into cooling havens, and rethinking how communities care for one another when the mercury rises. The 2003 heatwave didn't just shatter temperature records, it forced a reckoning with our climate future. As heat-related deaths still climb with each new summer, those 70,000 souls remind us adaptation isn't just technology. It's humanity learning too late for some, that survival in a warmer world demands more than air conditioners. It demands humility. The skies over Sydney turned an apocalyptic shade of red in December 2019, not from sunset, but from flames consuming an area larger than Portugal. Australia's bushfire season arrived with unprecedented fury, supercharged by record-breaking heat and drought. Towering fire fronts raced across eucalyptus forests at speeds that outpaced fleeing wildlife, leaving behind a charred graveyard of over 3 billion animals. Koalas burned alive in their treetops, kangaroos collapsing mid-leap, entire ecosystems erased in weeks. Smoke choked cities as far away as New Zealand, where glaciers turned caramel brown from airborne ash. But the crisis wasn't confined to the wilderness. Melbourne's air quality index soared to 20 times hazardous levels, forcing commuters to don gas masks on streets shrouded in eerie orange haze. Hospitals overflowed with patients suffering respiratory failure, while tennis matches at the Australian Open were halted when players vomited from smoke inhalation. The world watched in horror as vacationers on Bondi Beach posed for photos against a backdrop of blood-red skies, a dystopian postcard from the climate frontier. The fires reignited a global debate with white-hot intensity. Scientists pointed to climate models predicting drier, hotter conditions, exactly the tinderbox that fueled the catastrophe. Politicians, meanwhile, clashed over whether to address the root causes or focus solely on firefighting. The disaster became a rallying cry. Youth climate protests swelled from London to Tokyo, and even corporate giants faced pressure to divest from fossil fuels after watching Australia burn. Yet amid the devastation emerged unexpected heroes. Volunteer firefighters worked 90-hour shifts, their trucks dwarfed by 100-foot flames. Veterinarians scrambled to save singed koalas with hand-sewn mittens for their scorched paws. And in the ashes, nature offered fragile signs of hope. Rainforest trees thought extinct resprouted from buried roots, while burrowing species like wombats survived underground, their tunnels becoming accidental shelters for other animals. Australia's fiery reckoning didn't just scorch the land, it branded the global consciousness. When the last embers cooled, the question hung thick as smoke. If this was climate change's opening act, what encore awaits when the world keeps warming? Hurricane Maria wasn't just a storm, it was a reckoning. On September 20, 2017, the Category 4 monster slammed into Puerto Rico with winds tearing at 155 miles per hour. Roofs peeled away like banana skins, floodwaters swallowed entire neighborhoods, and the island's aging power grid collapsed into darkness. But the real tragedy unfolded in the aftermath, when the storm's fury gave way to a failure far more human in origin. For months, basic necessities became luxuries. Hospitals ran generators until fuel ran out, leaving doctors to operate by cell phone light. Mountain towns were cut off by landslides, their residents drinking from contaminated streams. Official death tolls initially claimed 64 lives, a number so absurdly low it sparked outrage. Independent investigations later revealed the true cost, likely over 3,000 deaths, many from preventable causes like untreated chronic illnesses or lack of clean water. The disaster peeled back layers of colonial neglect. As a U.S. territory, Puerto Rico lacked voting representation in Congress, leaving it powerless to expedite aid. Shipments of bottled water sat rotting in ports due to bureaucratic red tape, while mainland politicians publicly feuded over relief funding. Meanwhile, grassroots efforts like retired linemen volunteering to rebuild power lines highlighted the resilience of everyday people. Maria's lasting legacy wasn't just shattered homes but shattered illusions. Over 130,000 Puerto Ricans fled to the mainland in the storm's wake, many settling in Florida and New York. This exodus reshaped politics, demographics, and even baseball rosters, but it also carried a silent message. When nature strips away the veneer of stability, what's left isn't just rubble. It's the truth about who gets saved and who gets left behind. The crack of the bat at Candlestick Park on October 17, 1989, should have been the only sound echoing through San Francisco, but at 5:04 p.m., nature called an unplanned timeout. As 62,000 fans settled in for Game 3 of the World Series, the Loma Prieta earthquake struck with a magnitude 6.9 jolt, shaking the stadium like a toy in a child's hands. Broadcast cameras captured the surreal moment, light towers swaying violently, players stumbling on the infield dirt, and the collective gasp of a live audience realizing this wasn't part of the show. Across the Bay Area, freeway overpasses pancaked onto the roads below, sections of the Bay Bridge collapsed like a house of cards, and fires erupted in the Marina District where liquefied soil turned streets into quicksand. This wasn't just another California quake, it was a wake-up call televised to millions. For the first time, the nation watched seismic chaos unfold in real time during a primetime sporting event, shattering any illusion that earthquakes were someone else's problem. The disaster killed 63 people and left thousands homeless, but its most enduring legacy emerged from the wreckage, a seismic safety revolution. Engineers scrutinizing collapsed freeways discovered fatal flaws in their rigid designs, prompting a statewide retrofit program that would reinforce over 2,000 bridges with flexible joints and shock absorbers. Buildings once deemed safe were re-evaluated under stricter codes, especially those perched on unstable landfill like the devastated Marina District. Oddly enough, baseball itself became an unlikely hero in the recovery. When the World Series resumed 10 days later, the games weren't just about championships, they were a symbol of resilience, with proceeds funding relief efforts. The Loma Prieta quake didn't just rattle California, it rewrote the playbook for disaster preparedness, proving even the mightiest infrastructure is no match for the Earth's restless shifts unless we're willing to adapt. In the shadow of the Renaissance's brilliance, a horror crept through Italy's winding streets, one that would force humanity to rethink its battle against invisible enemies. The plague of 1630 wasn't just another outbreak, it was a gruesome classroom where desperation collided with early science. Venice, the glittering maritime empire, watched as ships carried not just spices and silk but death itself. Bodies piled up so quickly that mass graves overflowed, and the stench of decay clung to the canals. But amid the chaos, city leaders made a radical decision. Anyone arriving by sea had to wait 40 days, 40 giorni in Italian, before stepping ashore. This wasn't mere superstition, it was the birth of the word quarantine, a desperate gamble that sometimes kept the sick from entering and sometimes trapped the healthy with the dying. Over a century later, Moscow faced its own nightmare in 1771. As plague swept through the city, panic turned to violence, riots erupted, and a mob murdered the archbishop, accusing him of hiding poisoned religious relics. But this time, science began to outweigh fear. A young physician named Danilo Samoilovich risked his life to study the disease, boiling victims' clothing and even injecting himself with pus from the sick to prove contagion theories. His bold experiments demolished old myths, showing that the plague spread through contact, not divine wrath. These twin tragedies reveal a pivotal shift in human history, the moment we stopped blaming the stars or sinners and started trusting observation over omens. Italy's 40-day isolation became the template for modern containment, while Moscow's suffering proved that courage and curiosity could outlast even the deadliest scourges. Quarantines evolved from crude acts of survival into tools of salvation, laying the groundwork for everything from cholera wards to COVID lockdowns. Sometimes progress doesn't arrive in a flash of genius, it's born in the agony of pestilence, one faltering step toward light. In the summer of 1783, a strange fog crept across Europe, thick, sulphurous, and relentless. It blotted out the sun, seared leaves from trees, and left a bitter taste in the mouths of those who breathed it. Farmers watched helplessly as their crops withered under its acidic touch, unaware the source lay 800 miles away in Iceland, where the Laki fissure had split open like a wound in the earth. Over 8 months, this volcanic rift spewed enough toxic gas to poison continents, releasing sulfur dioxide equivalent to 3 times Europe's annual industrial emissions today. The immediate toll was apocalyptic. In Iceland, half the livestock perished from fluoride poisoning, their bones crumbling like chalk. Famine followed, wiping out a quarter of the island's population. But the disaster didn't stop at the coastline. The volcanic haze drifted south, triggering freak weather, freezing summers, brutal winters, and harvests so poor that bread prices skyrocketed. In France, where peasant families already spent 80% of their income on food, desperation turned to rage. Grain stores emptied, riots erupted, and whispers of revolt grew louder in breadlines. Historians now suspect Laki's climatic chaos didn't just precede the French Revolution. It helped ignite the tinderbox of inequality that fueled it. Yet amid the suffering, curiosity flared. Benjamin Franklin, then in Paris, noted the fog's eerie persistence and connected it to distant volcanic activity, one of the earliest links between eruptions and climate. Scientists today study Laki's aftermath as a chilling preview of how geoengineering gone wrong might unfold, proving that nature's experiments can be as educational as they are deadly. What began as fire and brimstone in a remote lava field ended up reshaping nations, a reminder that no society, no matter how powerful, is immune to the whispers of a restless planet. The Florida Keys basked under late summer sunshine on Labor Day weekend 1935 until the barometers began plummeting with terrifying speed. What started as a routine tropical disturbance in the Atlantic exploded into a monster almost overnight, its winds screaming past 185 miles per hour. By the time forecasters realized their mistake, the storm was already upon the Keys, its storm surge sweeping away entire railroad camps where World War I veterans had been sent to build a highway. This wasn't just any hurricane, it remains the strongest ever to make landfall in the United States. But its real legacy lies in the catastrophic forecasting failures that turned a disaster into a massacre. With no radar, no satellites, and spotty ship reports, meteorologists could only guess the storm's path. Weather Bureau officials in Washington dismissed evacuation warnings from local observers, convinced the system would curve harmlessly out to sea. Their arrogance carried a death toll. Over 400 perished, some swept out to sea, others crushed beneath collapsed buildings, their bodies discovered weeks later tangled in mangroves. Yet the tragedy forced a revolution in storm tracking. The Weather Bureau, stung by public outrage, established a dedicated hurricane warning center in Miami the following year. Researchers began flying planes into storms to gather real-time data, transforming forecasting from educated guesses into precision science. Today's intricate hurricane models and evacuation protocols trace their origins to those lethal errors in 1935, proof that sometimes progress demands the cruelest of teachers. The Labor Day hurricane didn't just rewrite weather history, it exposed the fatal cost of bureaucratic overconfidence. When the next monster storm brews, the ghosts of the keys whisper a warning. Nature doesn't negotiate with human pride. The clock struck 3:14 p.m. on May 22, 1960, when the ground beneath southern Chile began convulsing with unimaginable power. What started as a sharp jolt quickly escalated into a nightmare, the earth rippling like a rug being shaken, swallowing buildings whole as the Valdivia earthquake unleashed its record-shattering magnitude 9.5 fury. For 10 endless minutes, the planet itself seemed to groan under the strain, rupturing along a fault line nearly 600 miles long. Entire villages slid into the sea, while others saw the ground split open like a zipper, revealing chasms deep enough to swallow trucks. But the horror didn't stop when the shaking did. As coastal towns reeled from the damage, the ocean began an ominous retreat, a warning few recognized until it was too late. A tsunami towering over 80 feet crashed ashore, obliterating fishing communities from Chile to Hawaii and Japan. A day after the quake, waves reached as far as New Zealand and the Philippines, proving that seismic violence knows no borders. Even distant shores like Hilo, Hawaii, saw 61 lives lost to the same watery wrath that had begun half a world away. Oddly enough, this catastrophe became a turning point for global science. Instruments as far as Antarctica detected the quake's shockwaves, proof that Earth's crust had rung like a bell. Researchers suddenly grasped how interconnected our planet's seismic systems truly were, leading to the first international efforts for tsunami warning networks. Meanwhile, geologists studying the upheaval uncovered clues about subduction zones, the titanic collisions of tectonic plates that birth history's mightiest quakes. Valdivia's scars remain visible today in sunken shorelines and relocated rivers, but its legacy pulses through every earthquake drill, every offshore buoy monitoring for deadly waves, and every textbook explaining why some tremors rewrite the rules. When the ground moves with this much fury, it doesn't just reshape landscapes, it reshapes how humanity defends itself against the planet's restless power. The East Coast awoke to an ordinary March morning in 1993 until the sky darkened with an intensity that sent shivers down meteorologists' spines. This wasn't just another winter storm, it was a meteorological bomb swirling into existence with a central pressure lower than most hurricanes. Dubbed the storm of the century, its fury would stretch from Canada to Cuba, paralyzing the eastern seaboard in ways no blizzard had before. Within hours, whiteout conditions swallowed highways as snow fell at staggering rates, up to 4 inches per hour in some areas. But the real danger came from the wind, howling at hurricane force and whipping snow into 20-foot drifts that buried entire homes. Cities accustomed to winter weather ground to a standstill. Airports shut down, subway tunnels flooded, and power lines snapped under the weight of ice, leaving millions in the cold. Emergency responders found themselves overwhelmed, their vehicles useless against nature's blockade. Yet amid the chaos, this disaster became a pivotal test for modern forecasting. Unlike the surprise storms of the past, meteorologists saw this monster coming days in advance, thanks to advanced satellite data and computer models. Their warnings saved countless lives, proving that technology could buy precious time against nature's wrath. But the storm also exposed glaring gaps, rural communities cut off for weeks, urban hospitals struggling without backup generators, and communication networks crippled by overloaded circuits. The aftermath sparked a revolution in disaster preparedness. Power companies began burying lines deeper, states stockpiled more road salt, and emergency plans now account for snow hurricanes as a distinct threat. The storm of the century didn't just blanket the East in snow. It buried old assumptions, forcing a reckoning with how fragile our systems truly are when the skies decide to teach us humility. In April 2008, Cyclone Nargis gathered strength in the Bay of Bengal with a grim sense of inevitability. When it made landfall in Myanmar's Irrawaddy Delta, winds whipped at 135 miles per hour, but the real killer came from the sea, a 12-foot storm surge that drowned entire villages in minutes. The official death toll reached 140,000, though many suspect the true number was far higher. But here's what made Nagis different: the tragedy wasn't just natural. Myanmar's military junta, paranoid and isolated, initially blocked foreign aid workers and even confiscated relief supplies. For weeks, survivors drank from paddy fields contaminated by corpses while officials debated politics. The storm laid bare a brutal truth: when disaster strikes, the poorest often pay twice, first to nature's fury, then to human indifference. 5 years later, history seemed to echo, but louder. Typhoon Haiyan, one of the strongest storms ever recorded, smashed into the Philippines with winds approaching 200 miles per hour. The city of Tacloban resembled a war zone, with ships tossed ashore like toys and neighborhoods flattened by the force of a tsunami-like surge. Over 6,000 died, but this time the world reacted differently. Aid poured in swiftly, yet another inequity emerged. While global attention focused on Tacloban, remote islands like Bantayan received help weeks later. The typhoon didn't just test infrastructure, it exposed the uneven geography of compassion, how media coverage and political priorities can dictate who gets saved first. These twin catastrophes sparked uncomfortable questions. Why do storms seem to target nations least equipped to recover? Is it fair to call them natural disasters when corruption, inequality, and colonialism shape who survives? Climate scientists note warmer oceans fuel stronger cyclones, yet the countries suffering most, like Myanmar and the Philippines, contribute least to global emissions. After Haiyan, activists coined the term climate justice, demanding wealthy polluters foot the bill for resilience. The legacy of Nagis and Haiyan isn't just in broken buildings or revised wind speed records. It's in the growing movement to treat disaster response not as charity, but as restitution, a debt owed by those who warmed the planet to those left drowning in its storms. For decades, the snow-capped peak of Nevado del Ruiz loomed peacefully over Colombia until November 13, 1985. When the mountain reminded everyone why volcanoes never truly sleep. After a year of ominous tremors and gas emissions, Ruiz finally erupted shortly after 9 p.m., spewing hot ash that melted its glacial cap in minutes. What happened next wasn't lava or fiery explosions, but something far deadlier, a raging tsunami of mud, rocks, and debris called a lahar. This wasn't just some slow-moving sludge. It raced downhill at 30 miles per hour, swallowing entire neighborhoods in the town of Armero before most residents even heard the eruption. Witnesses described a deafening roar, then darkness as the 30-foot wall of mud obliterated homes, schools, and hospitals. By dawn, over 20,000 people lay buried beneath 16 feet of hardened earth, their final moments frozen in haunting photographs, like 12-year-old Amara Sanche, trapped for days in the wreckage as rescuers fought in vain to free her. The tragedy stung even more because it was preventable. Scientists had warned for months that Armero sat directly in a lahar's path, yet officials dismissed evacuation plans as unnecessary panic. Even as ash fell that night, mayors assured townspeople to stay put, a fatal misjudgment born of complacency. Yet Ruiz's aftermath rewrote disaster preparedness worldwide. Suddenly, lahar hazard maps became standard near glacial volcanoes from the Pacific Northwest to the Andes. Emergency drills now prioritize early alerts and rapid evacuations, while communities like Armero serve as grim classrooms, proof that ignoring nature's whispers can exact the cruelest price. What began as a rumbling in the earth ended as a lesson carved in mud and memory. Sometimes the deadliest force isn't the eruption itself, but the human reluctance to listen. The monsoon rains came to Kerala in August 2018, not as life-giving showers, but as an unrelenting deluge that refused to cease. Whole villages vanished underwater as rivers burst their banks, swallowing homes whole. Roads became rushing waterways, with families clinging to rooftops as helicopters circled overhead. This wasn't just heavy rainfall, it was India's worst monsoon in a century, dumping 3 times the usual seasonal downpour in just 9 days. As the waters rose, so did a troubling revelation. Decades of unchecked dam mismanagement had turned a natural event into a human catastrophe. Dozens of reservoirs, swollen beyond capacity, were forced to open their floodgates simultaneously, unleashing torrents that overwhelmed downstream communities with little warning. Critics pointed to ignored safety protocols, dams releasing water too late, without proper coordination, or worse, prioritizing electricity generation over flood prevention. The result, over 400 lives lost and 1 million displaced, many of whom might have been spared with better planning. Yet amidst the devastation, Kerala wrote a new chapter in disaster response. Ordinary fishermen steered their boats into flooded neighborhoods, rescuing thousands when official relief efforts faltered. Volunteers formed human chains to pass supplies through waist-deep water, while tech-savvy locals used social media to map rescue requests in real time. The floods didn't just expose system failures, they proved the power of community ingenuity when bureaucracy falls short. The disaster forced long-overdue reforms, from modernizing dam warning systems to re-evaluating how deforestation and urban sprawl amplify flood risks. Today, Kerala's tragedy stands as a stark lesson. Water sustains life, but without respect for its power, even the mightiest infrastructure can become part of the problem rather than the solution. December 5, 1952, dawned with Londoners shivering under an unusually cold winter, but by afternoon, something far more sinister had taken hold. A thick yellow fog rolled through the streets, stinging eyes and coating throats with a bitter, acrid taste. This wasn't just ordinary smog, it was a toxic cocktail of coal smoke, factory fumes, and stagnant air, so dense that visibility dropped to inches. Pedestrians groped along buildings like blind men. Buses crawled with guides walking ahead holding flares, and ambulance drivers abandoned vehicles carrying patients through the murk on foot. By the time the fog lifted 5 days later, an estimated 12,000 people had suffocated in what became known as the Great Smog of London. Yet what made this disaster so chilling wasn't just the death toll, it was how casually it had been dismissed at first. The government insisted the smog was just a bit of bad weather, while newspapers joked about pea soupers as a quirk of city life. Only when undertakers ran out of coffins and florists sold every bloom for funerals did officials grasp the scale of the catastrophe. Autopsies revealed lungs clogged with black sludge, victims' skin tinged blue from oxygen deprivation. The hardest hit, the poor, who burned cheap coal to stay warm and lived in neighborhoods where factories spewed unfiltered smoke. But from this ashy tragedy rose something unexpected. The modern environmental movement. The public outcry forced Parliament to pass the groundbreaking Clean Air Act of 1956, banning smoky fuels in urban areas and relocating power stations outside cities. For the first time, a nation recognized that progress shouldn't come at the cost of breathable air, a lesson etched in the soot-stained streets of London. Today, when cities from Beijing to Los Angeles battle pollution, they're fighting ghosts of the Great Smog, proof that sometimes the deadliest disasters spark the cleanest revolutions. On the last day of May in 1970, the earth beneath Peru's Andes Mountains convulsed without warning. The magnitude 7.9 Ancash earthquake ripped through the region, toppling adobe homes and sending panicked crowds into the streets. But the worst was yet to come. 45 seconds of shaking had destabilized the icy peak of Mount Huascaron, and as the tremors faded, 500 million cubic meters of rock, ice, and snow broke free. This wasn't just an avalanche, it was a titan of destruction, hurtling down the mountain at over 100 miles per hour. The sheer force peeled entire forests from slopes, churned villages into rubble, and sent a shockwave so powerful it flattened buildings miles away. When the wall of debris slammed into the town of Yungay, It buried nearly every structure under 40 feet of sludge and rock. Of the town's 20,000 residents, fewer than 400 survived, some saved only because they'd climbed to the cemetery on higher ground. Yet, even in the face of such staggering loss, humanity's resilience flickered to life. Rescuers dug through the debris with bare hands, unearthing survivors who'd clung to life in air pockets. The disaster forced Peru to reckon with its lack of preparedness, spurring seismic building codes and early warning systems that would save countless lives in future quakes. The scar left by Huascaron's avalanche remains visible today, a stark memorial to nature's power and a silent teacher of the lessons written in ice and rubble. Some wounds never fully heal, but they can become the bedrock of a stronger future. On the morning of October 8, 2005, the earth beneath Kashmir shuddered violently for nearly a full minute, a magnitude 7.6 earthquake that flattened entire towns in seconds. Brick buildings pancaked into piles of rubble, burying families alive. Landslides severed roads, leaving survivors trapped without food or water as winter approached. When the dust settled, the toll was staggering: 75,000 dead, 3 million homeless, and an entire region crying out for help. But in this moment of devastation, something unexpected unfolded along one of the world's most heavily militarized borders. India and Pakistan, nations locked in decades of conflict over Kashmir, found themselves facing a shared tragedy. Within hours, India offered aid to its longtime rival, and Pakistan, despite initial hesitation, accepted. Helicopters loaded with medical supplies crossed the line of control for the first time in nearly 60 years, while relief workers from both sides coordinated rescue missions in areas once patrolled only by soldiers. The disaster didn't erase tensions, but for a brief moment it shifted the narrative. Local Kashmiris, regardless of religion or nationality, worked side by side digging survivors from ruins. Journalists noted how desperate families cared less about flags and more about blankets as winter set in. The earthquake exposed a bitter irony. The same rugged terrain that made Kashmir a military battleground also made relief efforts agonizingly slow, leaving both nations grappling with the human cost of their standoff. Though political disputes eventually resumed, the disaster left behind fragile bridges. A cross-border trade route reopened briefly, and families separated by conflict reunited amid the chaos to search for loved ones. The Kashmir earthquake didn't rewrite history, but it proved that even in one of the world's most fractured regions, nature's fury can reveal our shared vulnerability beneath the divisions. Sometimes the ground doesn't just shake landscapes, it shakes assumptions. At precisely 3:02 am on August 17, 1999, the North Anatolian Fault ruptured violently near the Turkish city of Izmit. The magnitude 7.6 quake lasted just 37 seconds, but that was all it took to reduce entire apartment blocks to piles of pancaked concrete, trapping 20,000 people beneath the rubble before they could even wake up. When rescue teams reached the devastation at dawn, they found a grotesque pattern: modern buildings reduced to gravel while older structures stood cracked but intact. This wasn't just bad luck, it was criminal negligence laid bare. Investigations soon revealed a horrifying truth. Developers, bribing inspectors to look the other way, had diluted cement with excess sand, used thin steel rods, and skipped critical reinforcement steps, all to save a few dollars per floor. The so-called buildings of death crumbled not from the quake's power, but from the greed that cut corners on every safety measure. Even schools and hospitals collapsed, their blueprints signed off by officials who pocketed bribes instead of demanding accountability. The final toll, over 17,000 lives lost, many to collapses that proper construction could have prevented. Yet from the wreckage emerged a fierce reckoning. Protesters flooded Istanbul's streets demanding justice, and for once the system listened. Hundreds of contractors and officials faced prison time, while Turkey overhauled its building codes with seismic resilience as non-negotiable. Engineers developed new techniques like strong columns, weak beams to prevent total collapses and retrofitted thousands of at-risk structures. The disaster became a grim classroom, teaching that corruption isn't just immoral, it's lethal when the ground starts shaking. Izmit's legacy isn't measured solely in the graves it left behind, but in the lives saved by its painful lessons. Today, when a quake strikes Turkey, newer buildings sway but stand, proof that even the darkest tragedies can forge brighter standards if society finds the courage to demand them. In October 1737, the bustling port of Calcutta shuddered under a force no empire could control. The night of October 11th began like any other, until the ground heaved violently, collapsing brick buildings into clouds of dust. Ships anchored along the Hooghly River capsized as the river itself seemed to boil, swallowing entire docks. When the tremors ceased, at least 30,000 lay dead in a disaster later estimated at magnitude 8 or higher. But what made this catastrophe even more devastating was the response, or lack of it. The British East India Company, focused on trade and profit, downplayed the destruction, offering little aid to survivors. Official records buried the true scale, a pattern that would repeat a century later when nature struck again. In 1864, another monster roared ashore, the Great Calcutta Cyclone. Winds ripped at 150 miles per hour, driving a 30-foot storm surge through the city's low-lying districts. Entire neighborhoods vanished under the churning water, with over 60,000 lives lost in a single night. Yet once more, colonial authorities proved shockingly unprepared. Relief efforts favored European enclaves while Indian communities waited days for food and medical care. The few existing storm shelters had been built for British officials, leaving the majority of the population exposed to nature's fury. These twin disasters exposed a bitter truth. Colonial rule didn't just exploit resources, it neglected human lives when catastrophe struck. The lack of proper infrastructure, early warning systems, and equitable aid was no accident. It reflected priorities that valued commerce over compassion. Yet from these failures arose an unexpected silver lining. After the cyclone, local engineers began designing sturdier housing suited to the region's climate, while grassroots networks organized disaster relief decades before such efforts became official policy. The earth shook and the winds howled, but they also laid bare the cracks in empire and planted the seeds of resilience that would outlast colonial rule. Some lessons are written in rubble and floodwaters, waiting for those willing to read them. At 2:17 in the morning on October 6, 1948, the earth beneath Ashgabat convulsed without mercy. For 10 horrific seconds, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake reduced the Soviet city to mountains of shattered brick and twisted steel. Entire apartment blocks crumbled like sandcastles, burying families alive as they slept. When dawn broke, the survivors clawed through rubble with bare hands, finding streets transformed into graveyards, bodies piled so high they blocked roads. Official reports would later claim 10,000 dead, but the truth was far worse. Nearly 110,000 lives lost, making it one of history's deadliest quakes. Yet what happened next was almost as shocking as the disaster itself, a near-total blackout. Soviet authorities, fearing the earthquake would expose shoddy construction and poor emergency preparedness, sealed off the city. No foreign journalists were allowed, survivors were forbidden from speaking, and relief efforts were deliberately downplayed. For decades, the tragedy vanished from history books, its scale erased by propaganda insisting such devastation couldn't occur under socialist planning. Even memorials were banned, grief itself became a state secret, but whispers persisted. Eyewitnesses smuggled out accounts of hospitals so overwhelmed that doctors worked without anesthesia, amputating limbs with kitchen knives. Others described how the Kremlin diverted aid shipments to maintain the illusion of normalcy elsewhere. The truth only began surfacing after the Soviet Union's collapse, when archives revealed deliberate obfuscation, damning proof that politics had compounded nature's cruelty. Today, Ashgabat's scars remain visible in a haunting memorial finally erected in 1998. The earthquake didn't just collapse buildings, it shattered the myth of infallibility, revealing how easily fear can bury the truth. Some disasters reshape landscapes, others expose the cracks in empires. High in the Italian Alps, the Vajont Dam stood as a marvel of modern engineering, or so its builders believed. Completed in 1959, the towering concrete structure was meant to harness the power of mountain waters, a symbol of post-war progress, but beneath its gleaming surface lurked a fatal miscalculation. Engineers had ignored ancient landslide scars along Monte Toc slopes, dismissing locals' warnings that the mountain walked. On October 9, 1963, those warnings became prophecy. After weeks of heavy rains, 260 million cubic yards of rock, enough to fill the Grand Canyon's entire volume twice over, sheared off Monte Toc at 60 miles per hour. The landslide plunged into Vajont's reservoir, displacing a tsunami taller than the dam itself. A wall of water surged over the crest, obliterating villages downstream in minutes. Longarone, just a few miles away, ceased to exist. Buildings, bridges, and entire families swept away like leaves in a gutter. Nearly 2,000 lives vanished in the roaring darkness, many never found. The tragedy exposed a toxic blend of arrogance and negligence. Geologists had documented the mountain's instability years earlier, but their reports were buried under political pressures to complete the project. Officials even staged a controlled reservoir drawdown to simulate stability, a deadly theater performance for skeptical journalists. When survivors demanded answers, the trial that followed became Italy's largest negligence case, revealing how profit had trumped prudence at every turn. Yet Vajont's legacy isn't just a cautionary tale. Today, the empty dam stands as a haunting classroom, its reservoir permanently drained. Engineers worldwide study its failure, integrating geological humility into modern risk assessments. The disaster birthed stricter monitoring protocols and reshaped how we weigh human ambition against Earth's immutable laws. Because sometimes progress isn't about conquering nature, but listening to its whispers. The summer monsoon of 2010 should have been a blessing for Pakistan's farmlands, but when the rains refused to stop, they became a curse of biblical proportions. Week after week, entire provinces transformed into inland oceans, with floodwaters swallowing an area larger of England. Villages vanished underwater as the Indus River burst its banks, surging with force strong enough to topple bridges and sweep away entire neighborhoods. Unlike earthquakes or hurricanes that strike in moments, this disaster unfolded in slow motion, giving survivors just enough time to flee with nothing but the clothes on their backs but nowhere dry to go. What made this catastrophe so unprecedented wasn't just the scale: 20 million displaced, more than the combined toll of Haiti's earthquake and the Indian Ocean tsunami, but the agonizing duration. Floodwaters lingered for months, drowning crops, contaminating water supplies, and turning refugee camps into breeding grounds for cholera and malaria. Aid agencies faced a nightmare scenario. How do you help millions when roads are rivers and airstrips are lakes? Helicopters became lifelines, airdropping food parcels to families stranded on shrinking islands of high ground. Yet, even as the world mobilized, the crisis exposed painful inequities. While disasters in wealthier nations triggered swift international responses, Pakistan's floods, despite their staggering toll, faded from headlines within weeks. Donations lagged, in part due to geopolitical biases and misconceptions about the country's needs. Local heroes filled the gap, with farmers using makeshift boats to rescue neighbors and doctors working under tarps to treat waterborne diseases with dwindling supplies. The floods reshaped more than landscapes; they forced a reckoning with climate injustice. Scientists confirmed that warmer oceans had supercharged the monsoon, while deforestation and poor dam management amplified the damage. Pakistan, responsible for less than 1% of global emissions, was drowning in the consequences of others' actions. Today, the disaster stands as a warning. In a warming world, there's no such thing as a localized catastrophe. When the rivers rise, they expose not just submerged villages, but the fragile threads connecting humanity's shared fate. In late June 2021, thermometers across the Pacific Northwest did something terrifying. They stopped working. Not because they were broken, but because temperatures in cities like Portland and Seattle soared beyond their designed limits. A weather phenomenon known as a heat dome had parked itself over the region, trapping superheated air like a lid on a boiling pot. Records that had stood for decades didn't just fall, they were obliterated. Lytton, British Columbia, hit a staggering 121 degrees Fahrenheit before a wildfire incinerated the town the next day. This wasn't just another summer heatwave, it was a glimpse into our climate future. Scientists confirmed what the blistering pavement already whispered. Without human-caused climate change, such extremes would have been nearly impossible. The heat dome's intensity was like a 1-in-1,000-year event. Except climate models suggest these anomalies could become 1 in 50 or even 1 in 10-year occurrences by mid-century. But the tragedy also exposed an urban blind spot. Cities designed for mild maritime climates suddenly became death traps. Blacktop streets bubbled, power cables melted, and apartment buildings turned into ovens without air conditioning, a luxury many in the Pacific Northwest never thought they'd need. Over 1,000 lives were lost, disproportionately among the elderly, homeless, and those in low-income housing with no escape from the suffocating heat. Yet amid the suffering, innovation sparked. Cities scrambled to adopt cooling solutions from traditionally hot regions, planting shade trees over parking lots, painting rooftops reflective white, and designating emergency cooling centers. The disaster forced a painful but necessary reckoning. Climate change isn't just about melting glaciers or distant wildfires, it's about whether our grandmothers survived the next summer in apartments we never bothered to retrofit. The heat dome didn't just shatter records, it shattered the illusion that any corner of the planet remains untouched by the choices we've baked into the atmosphere. Time and again, nature has proven itself the ultimate game changer. No empire, no invention, no human ambition can stand against its raw power when it decides to rewrite the rules. From plagues that toppled civilizations to storms that rerouted the course of wars, these aren't just random acts of chaos, they're turning points where the planet itself became the architect of history. But here's the remarkable thing, humanity doesn't just collapse under these blows, we adapt, we rebuild. The same volcanic ash that choked crops in 536 led to innovations in farming. The earthquakes that shattered cities forced us to engineer stronger, smarter buildings. Every disaster carries a brutal lesson, and those willing to learn emerge wiser, tougher, more resilient. So, which of these moments shook you the most? Was it the Black Death rewriting Europe's social order, or the hurricane that birthed a nation? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We're all part of this ongoing conversation between humans and the forces that shape us. And if you're hungry for more stories where history and mystery collide, hit that subscribe button. The next chapter of Historical Mysteries is just a click away, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming. Nature's not done teaching us yet.